The kingdom of Valeria had survived generations of war, betrayal, and uneasy peace, but whispers drifting through its marble halls warned that another storm was approaching. Noble houses competed for influence over the aging king, alliances crumbled beneath greed, and ambitious lords quietly gathered supporters, hoping to seize power when the crown finally weakened. Every royal advisor searched desperately for a way to prevent open conflict, believing that carefully arranged marriages could bind rival families together before swords replaced negotiations. Among the names chosen to preserve the kingdom stood Lady Seraphina Ashcroft, a 22-year-old noblewoman whose gentle heart had never prepared her for becoming a political sacrifice. Seraphina had grown up inside a fading estate where ivy covered cracked stone walls and every candle was burned sparingly to save money. Her parents had died when she was still a child, leaving behind a respected family name but little wealth. Raised by her aging aunt, she learned compassion before luxury, spending more time helping villagers than attending glittering celebrations. Despite the hardships surrounding her, she refused to become bitter. She believed kindness could survive even in places where hope struggled to breathe, and that quiet strength often carried people farther than pride ever could. Everything changed when a royal messenger arrived bearing the king's seal. The decree announced that Seraphina would marry Duke William Ravenshire, the most powerful noble in Valeria and the man whose influence alone could stabilize half the kingdom. Refusal was impossible. The marriage was not presented as a request but as a duty owed to the crown. Her aunt wept in silence, knowing resistance would only destroy the little family they had left. Seraphina accepted the order with trembling hands, hiding the fear rising inside her behind a graceful smile that convinced no one. Stories about William reached every corner of the kingdom long before she ever saw him. At 25 years old, he had already earned a reputation as the cold duke, or ruler respected for his brilliant judgment and feared for his emotionless nature. After losing both parents in a violent conspiracy years earlier, he devoted himself entirely to responsibility, believing affection clouded reason and invited tragedy. He expanded his lands, strengthened the royal army, and governed with unwavering discipline, yet no servant could remember seeing him laugh, and few dared speak unless spoken to first. His imposing silence became as legendary as his victories. Their first meeting lasted only a few minutes inside the royal palace. William bowed with flawless courtesy but offered no warmth beyond formal etiquette. His sharp gray eyes studied Seraphina briefly before turning toward the ministers discussing military concerns, as though the woman standing beside him mattered less than the kingdom's next council meeting. Seraphina answered every question politely, determined to appear composed, yet disappointment quietly settled inside her heart. She had expected distance, but not complete indifference. Preparations for the wedding unfolded with breathtaking speed. Tailors stitched magnificent gowns, jewelers polished priceless heirlooms, and musicians rehearsed for a ceremony destined to become the grandest spectacle of the season. Citizens celebrated in crowded streets, convinced the union would prevent civil war and secure peace for another generation. They admired the beautiful bride and admired the formidable duke, believing destiny itself had paired them together. Only Seraphina understood that appearances often concealed painful truths. While everyone admired the approaching celebration, she wondered whether a marriage built upon obligation could ever become a home. The cathedral overflowed with nobles draped in silk and gold as sunlight poured through towering stained-glass windows, painting brilliant colors across polished marble floors. Seraphina walked slowly toward the altar, her elegant white gown flowing behind her like fresh snowfall, every graceful step carrying her farther from the peaceful life she once knew. William waited in ceremonial uniform, perfectly composed, his expression unreadable as the vows echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. When the priest declared them husband and wife, applause filled the sacred hall, yet the newlyweds exchanged only restrained smiles crafted for watching eyes rather than heartfelt joy. Night settled quietly over Ravenshire Manor after the celebrations ended. Servants withdrew, candles flickered softly, and an uncomfortable silence filled the lavish bridal chamber. Seraphina stood beside the window, gathering the courage to begin a conversation, hoping the privacy might soften the distance between them. Instead, William crossed the room, unlocked a polished mahogany drawer, and placed a neatly folded document upon the table separating them. His voice remained calm, almost detached, as he explained that their marriage would last exactly 1 year, serving only political necessity before ending through a peaceful divorce agreed upon in advance. Then he met her eyes for the first time that evening and said, "You're only my wife until this contract ends. Don't expect affection, and don't fall in love." The words struck harder than any insult. Seraphina's fingers trembled as she signed her name beneath his, refusing to let tears fall before him. When William quietly left the room without another glance, she held the contract against her chest, swallowed her heartbreak, and whispered into the empty silence, 1 year, then I'll leave with my dignity intact. Morning sunlight poured through the towering windows of Ravenshire Manor, but its warmth never reached the vast dining hall where Seraphina and William shared breakfast in complete silence. Every meal followed the same routine. Servants filled their plates, polished silverware reflected flickering candlelight, and the only sounds came from porcelain touching crystal. William reviewed official documents while eating, barely raising his eyes toward the woman seated across from him. Seraphina greeted him politely each morning, yet his replies never extended beyond a courteous nod. The contract had transformed their marriage into a carefully maintained performance, convincing outsiders they lived in harmony while leaving an invisible wall between their hearts. Days slipped into weeks with painful consistency. William departed before sunrise to attend military councils, inspect border defenses, and settle disputes among neighboring lords. He often returned long after darkness had claimed the sky, exhausted yet emotionally unreachable. Even when they crossed paths inside the manor's endless corridors, he addressed her only as Duchess, never once speaking her name. At first, Seraphina waited eagerly for small opportunities to start conversations, believing patience could slowly melt even the coldest heart. She asked about his work, wished him safe travels, and prepared thoughtful gifts, but every attempt dissolved beneath his restrained politeness. Eventually, hope became quieter than disappointment. The servants noticed everything their master ignored. Behind closed kitchen doors and inside busy laundry rooms, whispers traveled faster than footsteps. They spoke of the temporary marriage as though Seraphina could not hear them. Some pitied her gentle nature, while others dismissed her as nothing more than a placeholder destined to vanish when the year ended. Each careless remark found its way into her heart, reminding her that even the household considered her presence temporary. She never confronted anyone. Instead, she answered every greeting with kindness, believing bitterness would only grant victory to those who underestimated her. William occasionally overheard the gossip while passing through the manor, yet he remained silent. His expression never changed, and he offered neither agreement nor correction. To him, correcting idle conversation seemed unnecessary, but his silence carried consequences he failed to recognize. Seraphina interpreted it as acceptance. If he truly valued her, she reasoned, surely he would defend her dignity. Every day that passed without a word deepened the quiet ache she carried behind her composed smile. The greatest humiliation arrived during a royal banquet celebrating a successful harvest. Noble families gathered beneath glittering chandeliers, dressed in embroidered silks and precious jewels. Among the guests stood Lady Vivian Beaumont, William's former fiancée, whose engagement had ended years earlier after political disagreements between their families. Beautiful, elegant, and accustomed to admiration, Vivian approached Seraphina with flawless manners concealing unmistakable cruelty. She praised the Duchess's gown before remarking that temporary wives rarely needed expensive wardrobes. Several nearby nobles laughed politely, pretending the insult had been harmless conversation. Seraphina responded with remarkable grace, thanking Vivian for her concern without allowing anger to cloud her voice. Her calmness frustrated Vivian, who stepped closer and suggested that some women mistook legal contracts for genuine affection. William witnessed the exchange from across the ballroom. He calmly intercepted Vivian before she could continue, guiding her away with measured courtesy, yet he offered no explanation, apology, or public defense of his wife. To every observer, his actions appeared diplomatic. To Seraphina, they felt painfully insufficient. She smiled through the remainder of the evening, accepted every compliment expected of a duchess, and returned home carrying invisible wounds no physician could heal. That night she cried alone beside the bedroom window, staring across moonlit gardens where roses bloomed despite the coming autumn. She realized she had spent months chasing warmth from someone unwilling to offer it. Yet even in loneliness, resentment refused to take root inside her heart. She remembered the struggling villages surrounding the estate, the orphan children lacking proper shelter, and the elderly farmers unable to afford medicine. If love remained beyond her reach, perhaps purpose did not. The following morning she requested permission to inspect the Duke's lands, explaining that she wished to understand the people whose lives depended upon Ravenshire Manor. William approved the request without asking questions. He assumed she merely sought distraction, never imagining how deeply the journey would transform both her reputation and eventually his own perspective. Seraphina traveled from village to village, listening before speaking. She noticed leaking roofs above orphanages, empty cupboards inside widows' cottages, and exhausted families surviving harsh winters with little assistance. Rather than offering sympathetic words alone, she quietly organized repairs, distributed food from the estate's overflowing granaries, and sold several pieces of her personal jewelry to purchase blankets, medicine, and schoolbooks for children who had never owned one. She asked for no recognition, insisting every act remain anonymous whenever possible. Nevertheless, gratitude spread quickly. Villagers soon began calling her the Angel Duchess, celebrating the compassion she carried wherever she walked. One crisp afternoon William returned unexpectedly from inspecting the northern border and paused outside a modest orphanage near the estate. Through an open gate he saw Seraphina kneeling beside a circle of laughing children, her elegant dress stained with grass as she helped them plant young apple trees. She laughed freely, brighter than he had ever witnessed within the manor's silent walls. The sight stopped him where he stood. For reasons he could not explain, he remained hidden beneath the branches, watching the woman he believed he understood, suddenly wondering why her happiest smiles had never been meant for him. William could not erase the image of Seraphina laughing among the orphan children. The memory followed him through military meetings, council discussions, and long rides across his lands. He had always believed emotions distracted leaders from duty, yet her smile lingered in his thoughts with surprising persistence. For the first time in years, his carefully ordered routine felt unsettled. He found himself wondering how a woman burdened with a loveless marriage could still offer such genuine warmth to complete strangers. The question refused to leave him, no matter how firmly he buried himself in work. Without realizing it, William began paying attention to details he had once ignored. Each evening, when he returned to Ravenshire Manor, a warm meal waited despite the unpredictable hour of his arrival. Fresh tea appeared beside his desk before he remembered requesting it. Whenever harsh weather forced him to inspect distant villages, dry gloves and a heavier cloak somehow found their way into his traveling carriage. At first he assumed the servants anticipated his needs, but one elderly butler quietly informed him that every thoughtful arrangement came from the Duchess. William offered no reply, though he noticed himself lingering over meals she had personally selected, appreciating comforts he had previously accepted without thought. Seraphina never expected gratitude. She simply continued caring for the household because kindness remained part of her character rather than an attempt to earn affection. She repaired the loose stitching on William's riding gloves after noticing worn seams across the fingers. She instructed the cooks to prepare lighter meals when reports mentioned he had skipped lunch during council sessions. On evenings when rain soaked the countryside, she placed herbal medicine outside his study door without interrupting his work. She never entered unless invited, respecting the distance he had established from the beginning of their marriage. Quiet devotion became her language, even after she convinced herself it would never be returned. William slowly grew accustomed to these unseen gestures. If tea failed to appear, he instinctively looked toward the door before remembering she might be away visiting nearby villages. If a cloak felt unusually comfortable during a journey, he recognized the careful adjustments she had made to improve its fit. These realizations unsettled him because they revealed how deeply her presence had woven itself into his ordinary life. The contract had promised emotional distance, yet invisible threads connected them in ways he had never intended. Late one autumn afternoon, dark clouds gathered above Valeria, releasing relentless rain that transformed narrow roads into rushing streams. A messenger arrived carrying alarming news that several cottages near the eastern river had flooded after heavy storms overwhelmed the banks. Before William could organize emergency assistance, Seraphina had already departed with volunteers, determined to rescue families trapped by rising waters. When he learned she had entered the flooded village herself, a fear unlike anything he had experienced tightened around his chest. Without hesitation, he mounted his horse and rode toward the river through pounding rain. The flooded streets had become dangerous currents carrying broken fences and shattered furniture downstream. Villagers shouted directions while struggling to pull children toward higher ground. William finally spotted Seraphina standing waist-deep in icy water, holding a frightened little girl in her arms while encouraging two younger boys toward waiting rescuers. Her face remained calm despite exhaustion, but once the final child reached safety, her strength disappeared. She staggered forward before collapsing into the rushing water. William leaped from his horse without hesitation, lifting her into his arms as rain poured across both of them. She felt frighteningly cold against his chest, and for the first time since losing his parents, genuine panic overwhelmed every disciplined thought. Back at Ravenshire Manor, the estate physician diagnosed a severe fever brought on by exhaustion and prolonged exposure to freezing water. Seraphina drifted in and out of restless sleep while servants hurried between the kitchen and her room carrying medicine and fresh linens. William dismissed everyone except the physician and remained beside her bed throughout the night. Whenever her fever worsened, he replaced cool cloths upon her forehead with trembling hands. Hours passed unnoticed as he watched the woman who had transformed countless lives while expecting nothing for herself. The possibility of losing her suddenly felt unbearable, exposing emotions he had spent years denying. During the third night, Seraphina's breathing became uneven, and William believed she might never awaken. Assuming unconsciousness shielded his words from embarrassment, he leaned closer and gently clasped her hand. His composed voice finally broke beneath the weight of fear. "Please don't leave me," he whispered. "I don't know when you became important, but this house is empty without you." Tears gathered in his eyes before he quickly brushed them away, ashamed of feelings he could neither explain nor control. At dawn, Seraphina's fever finally began to subside, and her breathing steadied. Relief flooded through him, yet as soon as she slowly opened her eyes, years of guarded habit returned. He stepped back, thanked the physician for successful treatment, and greeted her with distant courtesy, hiding every vulnerable confession behind the familiar mask of the cold Duke. Seraphina remembered waking briefly to the sound of someone speaking, but the words remained blurred like fragments of a fading dream. William's reserved expression convinced her she had imagined everything. As her strength gradually returned, she accepted that nothing between them had changed. Only 2 months remained before the contract expired. One quiet evening she unfolded a calendar, carefully marking each remaining day with neat strokes of ink before placing the signed contract beside a small suitcase. Standing silently in the doorway, unseen by her, William watched her prepare for a future without him, and for the first time in his life, he wished he had never written the agreement that was now stealing away the only person who had ever made his lonely house feel like a home. The final weeks of the contract passed with a quietness that felt heavier than open conflict. Seraphina no longer waited beside the dining table for William to return from his endless meetings, nor did she leave warm tea outside his study every evening. She fulfilled every responsibility expected of a duchess with unwavering grace, but she carefully withdrew the small acts of affection that had once become part of their daily lives. She had finally accepted that love could not be nurtured by one heart alone. Every day she folded another piece of clothing into her traveling trunk, preparing herself to leave Ravenshire Manor without bitterness, only with the determination to protect the dignity she had promised herself on the night she signed the contract. William noticed the changes immediately, though he pretended otherwise. The manor had not become louder or busier, yet it felt strangely empty. The silence around him was no longer peaceful but unsettling. Meals tasted ordinary without her thoughtful attention, the library seemed colder after sunset, and even the gardens appeared lifeless when she no longer wandered among the flowers each morning. He wanted to ask why she had stopped waiting for him, yet every opportunity slipped away because pride still chained the words inside his throat. The distance he had once demanded had become the punishment he could no longer endure. Around that time, Sir Elias Hawthorne returned to the capital after serving several years on the northern frontier. Known throughout the kingdom for his courage and unwavering honor, Elias had grown up near the Ashcroft estate and had been one of Seraphina's closest childhood companions before military duty separated them. Unlike William's reserved nature, Elias greeted people with genuine warmth and listened carefully before speaking. When he learned that Seraphina now lived as Duchess of Ravenshire, he requested permission to visit, believing he was simply paying respect to an old friend. Neither of them anticipated how significant that reunion would become. When Seraphina welcomed Elias into the manor's garden, she felt an unfamiliar sense of comfort. They spoke about childhood memories, shared stories of changing seasons, and laughed over harmless mischief from years long past. Elias noticed the sadness hidden behind her polite smile but never questioned her directly. Instead, he treated her with the same kindness he always had, allowing her to speak only when she wished. For the first time in many months, Seraphina laughed without forcing herself to appear cheerful. The sound carried across the garden like music that had long been absent from the estate. Their friendship continued through brief afternoon walks and charitable visits to nearby villages. Elias accompanied her while delivering food, repairing schools, and comforting families who had suffered during the recent floods. He admired her compassion openly, never embarrassing her with excessive praise but acknowledging the goodness she offered others every day. During one quiet walk beneath blooming chestnut trees, he paused beside a field of wildflowers and handed her a small bouquet gathered from the roadside. Smiling gently, he said, "You deserve a love that doesn't come with an ending." His words were spoken without pressure or expectation. They were simply the truth as he understood it. William witnessed several of these meetings from a distance. At first he dismissed them as innocent conversations between old friends, but each passing encounter awakened unfamiliar emotions. Seeing Seraphina smile beside another man tightened something deep within his chest. Watching Elias remember her favorite flowers while he himself had never learned such simple details filled him with painful regret. Jealousy arrived without warning, stripping away the illusion that he remained emotionally detached. He finally understood that he was not afraid of losing a political wife. He was terrified of losing the woman who had quietly become the center of his world. For several sleepless nights William wrestled with the truth he had spent months avoiding. He reread the contract until every sentence felt cruel. The confident words he had once considered practical now appeared heartless and cowardly. Determined to repair the damage before it became permanent, he secretly ordered preparations for an unforgettable evening. The grand ballroom transformed beneath thousands of glowing candles. White roses decorated every pillar, musicians rehearsed gentle melodies, and a new marriage certificate replaced the old contract. This document contained no expiration date, no conditions, and no promise of separation. It offered only a lifetime shared willingly. William planned to confess everything he had hidden behind pride and ask Seraphina to choose him freely for the first time. The final day of the agreement arrived beneath clear autumn skies. William waited inside the glowing ballroom, dressed not as a distant duke but as a hopeful husband. Every passing minute deepened his anticipation until concern slowly replaced confidence. The musicians lowered their instruments, candles burned shorter, and the doors remained closed. Finally, an elderly servant entered carrying a small wooden box. Inside rested Seraphina's wedding ring, carefully placed beside the signed divorce papers. A brief note thanked William for honoring the contract exactly as promised and wished him lasting happiness. She had already departed the estate. William's heart seemed to stop. Without another thought he abandoned the ballroom, raced through the manor, and mounted his horse despite the servants calling after him. Rain began falling as he reached the city gates, soaking his clothes while frantic questions echoed inside his mind. Guided by hurried witnesses, he finally found Seraphina standing beside Elias near a waiting carriage bound for her family's estate. Travelers paused to watch as the kingdom's proudest duke stumbled forward through the rain. Ignoring every rule of noble dignity, William fell to his knees before the woman he had failed to cherish. His voice broke beneath the weight of regret as he pleaded, "Burn the contract. Punish me. Hate me if you must. Just don't leave me." Tears filled Seraphina's eyes as she whispered, "You taught me I was only temporary." William looked up through the rain and answered, "No. I was the fool. You're the only place that has ever felt like home." Before she could respond, the thunder of galloping horses shattered the moment as royal soldiers rushed into the square with urgent news that the kingdom had fallen into rebellion, and William was ordered to ride immediately into war. The desperate confession in the rain remained suspended between William and Seraphina as royal soldiers surrounded the town square with urgent expressions. Their commander dismounted and announced that several ambitious nobles had launched an armed rebellion against the crown, hoping to seize the capital before loyal forces could organize a defense. As the kingdom's strongest military leader, William was ordered to ride immediately for the eastern frontier, where fierce fighting had already begun. Every instinct urged him to remain beside Seraphina until she answered his plea, yet duty demanded a different path. He stepped toward her, gently taking her trembling hands into his own, and for the first time since their wedding, he looked at her without hiding behind pride. "Come home to me," he said softly. "Please, my wife." The words carried no political obligation, no contractual distance, and no trace of cold indifference. They came only from a man who finally understood the value of the heart standing before him. Seraphina watched him ride away beneath darkening skies until his figure disappeared beyond the city gates. She had longed to hear those words for an entire year, yet they arrived at the very moment fate threatened to take him from her forever. Elias quietly stepped beside her, understanding that her silence came not from uncertainty but from fear. He smiled with gentle sadness before thanking her for the friendship they had shared since childhood. Without resentment or bitterness, he admitted that William's eyes now held the devotion every husband should have shown from the beginning. He encouraged her to follow her heart rather than her disappointment, then mounted his own horse and departed to assist the royal army. Watching him leave, Seraphina realized true affection never demanded possession. It wished only for another person's happiness, even when that happiness belonged elsewhere. The rebellion spread quickly across Valeria, turning peaceful fields into battlefields scarred by smoke and shattered stone. Reports reached the capital each day describing fierce clashes between loyal soldiers and rebellious forces. Seraphina refused to remain idle inside Ravenshire Manor while others suffered. She organized supplies, supervised wagons carrying medicine to military camps, and transformed part of the estate into a refuge for displaced families. Every evening she searched desperately for news of William, clinging to hope whenever messengers arrived. Although exhaustion weighed heavily upon her, purpose kept despair from overwhelming her spirit. She prayed not only for victory but for the safe return of the man whose heart had finally opened just before war separated them. Several weeks later, a lone rider arrived at the manor carrying grim news. The royal army had defeated the rebellion after a decisive battle near the eastern hills, securing peace throughout the kingdom. Victory, however, came at a terrible price. William had placed himself between the king and an enemy commander during the fiercest fighting, suffering a devastating sword wound that left him hovering between life and death. Before the messenger finished speaking, Seraphina was already preparing a carriage. Nothing could keep her from reaching him. The military hospital occupied a quiet monastery overlooking rolling fields where the final battle had ended. Inside a modest stone chamber, William lay unconscious, his face pale from blood loss, his breathing slow but steady beneath carefully wrapped bandages. Seraphina hurried to his bedside, taking his hand as tears finally escaped the composure she had maintained for so many months. She remained there from sunrise until deep into every night, refusing invitations to rest in more comfortable quarters. She read aloud from his favorite history books, changed fresh flowers beside the window each morning, and whispered stories about the villagers whose lives continued improving because of his support. She wanted him to remember that a future still waited beyond the pain if only he would open his eyes. Days blended together while physicians cautiously monitored his recovery. Many believed his strength alone kept him alive, yet Seraphina believed love fought beside every medicine they administered. Whenever doubt crept into her thoughts, she remembered the sincerity in William's voice beneath the rain and refused to surrender hope. She realized she had never truly stopped loving him. Her heart had simply hidden behind the same fear that once imprisoned his. Now that every misunderstanding had been stripped away, she wanted nothing more than the chance to begin again without contracts, conditions, or pride. Early one peaceful morning, sunlight slipped through the monastery window and rested across William's face. His fingers moved slightly within Seraphina's grasp before his eyes slowly opened. Confusion lingered only a moment before recognition replaced it. The first thing he saw was Seraphina sitting faithfully beside him, her eyes bright with exhausted relief. He reached weakly toward her cheek and smiled with quiet tenderness. "My wife," he whispered. There were no noble titles separating them, no careful distance protecting wounded hearts, only simple words carrying complete devotion. Overcome with emotion, Seraphina leaned forward and kissed his forehead as tears of joy fell freely between them. Neither needed another explanation because forgiveness had already found its place beside love. A full year after the rebellion ended, Ravenshire Manor welcomed guests from every corner of the kingdom. Before nobles, villagers, and members of the royal court, William placed the original marriage contract into a silver brazier. He watched the paper curl into flames until nothing remained except drifting ashes. Turning toward the gathered crowd, he declared that love could never flourish where fear dictated its limits. Then he faced Seraphina, knelt before her with a new ring, and asked her to marry him again, not because duty required it, but because his heart could imagine no future without hers. Smiling through joyful tears, she accepted. Their second wedding overflowed with genuine laughter instead of careful appearances, and together they spent the following years rebuilding orphanages, supporting struggling villages, and creating a home filled with kindness. One quiet evening, their young daughter discovered a small glass box containing ashes from the burn contract and asked what they represented. William lifted the child into his arms, kissed Seraphina gently, and replied, "The greatest mistake I ever made, and the reason I learned that love should never have an ending." Hand in hand, they watched the sun disappear beyond the hills, knowing the agreement that once promised separation had become the foundation of a lifetime they freely chose together.